So when you put all this together, what we glean, what is different about the lives of mothers of adolescents and adults with autism spectrum disorders and comparison mothers is that these mothers feel more fatigued during the day, they have more intrusions into their workday, they spend more time in childcare and chores and less time on their own leisure activities, and they experience more stress of all types, not just related to their son or daughter. They also have a greater exchange of emotional support, and there's a high level of exposure to behavior problems. So we naturally asked, what's the physiological effect of all of this? You know, this is an intense characterization of daily life, and across many years and decades, if this is happening, is there a physiological effect of this? And again, is this such that we need to use these data for advocacy for different kinds of services? So as I said, we collected saliva, and from the saliva we extracted cortisol, which is a hormonal marker of stress. And just to remind you, on days 2, 3, 4, and 5, we collected the saliva at 4 periods of time: before getting out of bed, 30 minutes later, right before lunch, and before going to bed at the end of the day. And what we're able to do, because this 4-day period, days 2, 3, 4, and 5, is embedded in the 8-day diary study, we're able to look at the co-occurrence of behavior problems and fluctuations in cortisol. So we have a lot of specific data, and if you're interested in that, I can direct you to where on our website you could see the data. But for purposes of today, what I want to just show you is the overall differences in cortisol level between the mothers in our study and the comparison group. So this is the normal pattern of cortisol expression. So when you wake up in the morning, your level is at a certain point, and then there's an increase that happens during that first 30-minute period, and that's good. It's an increase that allows you to sort of rev up for the day and get the energy you need to get through the day. And then gradually cortisol levels decline throughout the day, and they're lowest among the points of the day that we measured when you go to bed at night. So that's the typical sort of ebb and flow, or flow and ebb, of cortisol during the day, and this is normal. And there are many ways where these patterns can be dysregulated. And here, I just show you 2 hypothetical examples. Sometimes there have been lots of studies of acute stress. And when there's acute stress, a short-term unexpected stressor, cortisol levels shoot up, and they end up being high. And then with chronic stressors of other types, there's been a documentation of lower levels of cortisol, hypoactivation. So even though there is stress present, you no longer have this high spike of cortisol in response to it. And what's important for us as we sort through the data is to recognize that the mothers in our study are exposed to both acute stress, the daily behavior problems, and daily autism symptoms, and also chronic stress over years and decades. And so we were interested to see if we could begin to understand how the physiological effects of both acute and chronic stress were to play out in terms of this one biomarker. And this is what we found. The mothers of individuals with autism in our study had lower levels of cortisol. They had a hypoactivated pattern. And it looks like it's more or less the same at the go-to-bed point, but it's actually even statistically significant at that point as well. So mothers in our study wake up with lower levels of cortisol, have a lower amplitude of increase during the morning, 30 minutes, and then it declines and it ends up being somewhat lower at the end of the day. And this is a pattern that is not unique to autism. We've seen this in other families of individuals with developmental disabilities, in mothers as well as fathers as well as mothers. But it's most marked, in our analyses, the hypoactivation is greatest, the most lowered. The cortisol is most lowered in the mothers of individuals with autism as compared to other developmental disabilities. And we think this is the physiological signature of chronic stress. It's not surprising. You know, when mothers reported on 50% of the days in the diary data that they report fatigue, you know, low cortisol is associated with feelings of fatigue. So the self-reported symptoms, the experience that mothers have, maps onto the physiology. And one unanswered question, and it's something that we're trying to sort out, is whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, generally you think that significantly and lower levels of cortisol are a risk factor for poor health. That's been shown, but I'm not sure that continuously upregulation of cortisol is a good thing either. In other words, it may be an adaptive response to modulate cortisol, the body's adaptive response over a long period of caregiving. So part of what we are seeking to understand is whether the mothers who have low cortisol, because these are average data, whether the mothers in our study whose cortisol is low, particularly low, end up having particular health problems, or whether there isn't a downstream consequence of high levels of cortisol. And that's an unknown question that we seek to understand. And it may be that it will take us a while before this biomarker translates into illness, or maybe it won't. So I don't know that I think we should be cautious in our interpretation of what this means. In data that I'm not showing you, we have linked behavior problems yesterday with cortisol today. So we know that there's a one-to-one connection between the stress they experienced yesterday with respect to their child and the level of cortisol the next day. And when they have an unexpectedly bad day yesterday in terms of their child's behavior, cortisol is particularly dampened the next day. So it's a pretty tight relationship between the exposure to stress and the cortisol response, but what we don't know is what's the consequence of that for illness in the longer run. So, you know, that's to be continued. I think there are some implications of these data for service providers and for parents and for grandparents. And, you know, again, this is my advocacy message, and I know that the Grandparents Autism Network is an advocacy-oriented organization. And for service providers here, I say that this is, you know, evidence that we should be working hard to think about how to support families throughout the life course, and that we have to think about management of behavior problems in adults as well as in children, and that when I read the descriptions of sons and daughters in adulthood, although the descriptions tend to show that there's a maturation process and an improvement, we're talking about bigger bodies, bigger people, much more difficult to manage, and so we've got to have the service system stepping up to focus on behavior problems in a way that, in my experience, I don't think they are. I think the implications for parents is the importance of stress reduction activities and the importance of leisure, and it's easy to say and hard to do, but there's more and more evidence about the effect of mindfulness meditation, of yoga, and of other things for sort of maintaining focus, reducing stress, and I think that it's very important to experimentally investigate the effects of meditation and yoga and other activities on physiological functioning, but I would say it's something to explore. And probably many of you are doing that. And then for grandparents, these data really call out for the need for help and support for families and for parents and families in everyday life. And that's, again, nothing that you don't know, but I think we have some data to support what you know.